For the last few decades, the global economic order was built upon the idea that free trade was good and should be encouraged, protected, and conducted wherever possible. Institutions and agreements were built to uphold this foundational principle of the post-war era, driving more economic and political integration in what seemed to be an ever-globalising world. But in the last few years, global integration has slowed down, if not reversed. Trade barriers and industrial policy have returned to the forefront of political agendas, economic unions fragment as nations feel they're getting less than they're putting in, and state intervention to impose sanctions and minimise vulnerabilities have been necessitated by escalating tensions and all-out conflict. It's fairly obvious to see that the world has taken a less eager and more critical stance on free trade. Geopolitical considerations have become a larger factor in calculating risk and making decisions for both businesses and governments. But it's not just countries that are exposed to the hostilities of protectionism. Global institutions themselves are getting caught in the crossfire. So, do recent events simply represent a reshaping of the global economy towards more regionalised production and safeguarding of national security following a period of over-globalisation? Or does it signify a deterioration of diplomatic trust and unwillingness to cooperate on geopolitical issues, and more generally, an erosion of the global order? To answer this, we need to explore a few questions. Why is protectionism and regionalisation occurring? How has the World Trade Organization been rendered powerless on the matter? And what does this mean for the future of globalisation? The increase in protectionism across the globe has occurred in the important context of many crises. The pandemic shook global supply chains, and extreme weather events triggered export bans on key goods. Simultaneously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine necessitated new trade barriers and increased fragmentation when countries voted over whether to formally condemn the invasion in the United Nations. Then the global causes of the cost of living crisis drove popular opinion towards reducing dependencies and strengthening domestic industry. Generally speaking, pressures have increased in recent years, bringing protectionist measures back in vogue, similar to how the Great Depression brought about the anti-trade sentiment in the 1930s. This pressure has brought geopolitical tensions to the surface, and there's no better example than the escalating hostilities between the world's two largest global powers, the USA and China. Both states are competing to secure production and ownership of the most advanced technologies of the future. For all of human history, civilizations with the most advanced technologies thrived and dominated rivals. Where once those cutting-edge technologies were aqueducts, printing presses, or muskets, they are now digital technologies like artificial intelligence and automated robotics. All of these new technologies have one foundational backbone that they're built upon: semiconductor computer chips. And because of this, they are a very important strategic focus for many countries. Currently, 90% of all advanced chips, that is the smallest, fastest, highest capacity chips, are produced in one perilously vulnerable island, Taiwan. I'm sure by now you know that it's one of the most tense geopolitical standoffs of our time. China recognises Taiwan as one of its own provinces and promises reunification, while the USA unofficially maintains relations with Taiwan and supplies its arms. It's thought that the USA would directly intervene with its own military to protect Taiwan from a Chinese invasion, and they have demonstrated this willingness before during the Taiwan Strait crisis of 1995 to 1996. But back then the stakes were a lot lower, China was not nearly as powerful as it is today, and the world was not nearly as dependent on advanced semiconductors coming out of Taiwan. If a full-scale Chinese invasion of Taiwan played out, then manufacturing of advanced digital technologies could grind to a halt. This threat is so tangible that the semiconductor plant in Taichung is a 7-minute drive from a major air force base where Taiwanese troops practice countering a Chinese invasion. This whole situation is a colossal risk to the technical progression of modern civilization, but despite this, the deadlock between China and the US remains to be solved, and President Xi Jinping continues to profess the inevitable reunification with their family across the Taiwan Strait. He has staked his legacy on this matter, and with the threat of modern war becoming more palatable since the return of the conflict in Europe and the Middle East, the rising tensions between the two global superpowers has become an unmistakably large factor as to why protectionism measures are on the rise. But there are doubts as to whether Xi Jinping is serious about reunification with Taiwan, at least in the short run. The USA is a bigger military power, and the Chinese export-driven economy is particularly exposed to sanctions. But regardless of how legitimate the big talk is, the US government has used the geopolitical risk to justify hardline protectionism. The Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors Act, conveniently acronymed to CHIPS, was signed into law by President Biden in 2022. This authorised $280 billion in subsidies and tax breaks for research, investment, and the production of semiconductors, provided it's done on US soil. This included billions to draw industry titan, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, away from the treacherous waters of the Taiwan Strait to build new factories in Arizona. Representatives of the CCP criticised the act, saying it symbolised a Cold War mentality and represented double standards. However, many would argue that China has had this coming for a while. The Taiwan beef continues alongside a highly protectionist business environment in China that gives preferential treatment to domestic corporations, not just in the semiconductor industry, but within technological sectors as a whole. The Chinese Communist Party heavily, and many would argue unfairly, subsidises its own technological production like electric vehicles, solar panels and ships, artificially cheapening its products to dominate the global market and strengthen its industrial power. Foreign inventors in China are 50% less likely to be granted a strategic patent than locals, and in certain industries, foreign companies are only allowed to access the Chinese market if they enter a joint venture with a Chinese firm. Foreign equity is also frequently blocked. The abrasiveness of China's actions extends beyond economic policy though. A damning investigation by the US in 2018 concluded that China had, and I quote, conducted and supported unauthorised intrusions into and theft from the computer networks of US companies to access their IP, including trade secrets and confidential business information. The US claims that these violations are ongoing, whilst China has denied the allegations of state-sponsored cyber theft, arguing that the accusations lack concrete evidence and have accused the US of widespread surveillance and hacking themselves. If there's one takeaway here, it's that the governments do not trust one another. In light of all of this, the US has acted to match China with its own protectionism. For example, the US tariff on Chinese electric vehicles recently rose to 100%. And in case the US CHIPS Act wasn't already insulting enough to China, the hostilities were made undeniably explicit when the Biden administration banned the export of advanced chips and chip-making tools to selected Chinese companies. China has responded by banning the export of rare earth metals to the US, such as gallium, germanium, and antimony. These are critical elements needed to make semiconductors and other technologies like fiber optics and solar panels, and China completely dominates global rare earth mineral extraction and processing, a vulnerability that the US is scrambling to resolve through, again, industrial policy. So really, US protectionism in the semiconductor industry is 1, a retaliation to what it sees as unfair practice and aggression from China, and 2, a realisation that the dependence on a geopolitically fragile foreign industry for the foundation of technology of the future leaves them vulnerable. More generally, the battle between the US and China shows just how easy it can be for protectionism to quickly ramp up because it's self-fulfilling. And when the two largest powers in the world become more abrasive in their industrial and trade policy, then the rest of the world will naturally follow suit. Precedence has been established and the protectionism traffic light has just flicked to green. The media tends to dramatise this as a clash of the titans, but in fairness, if you actually look at the data, you wouldn't be able to tell any of this tit for tat was happening. Rather, you'd think that China and the US were best of chums. Total goods trade between these two countries remains dizzyingly high and hasn't fallen even after the host of tariffs that were introduced from 2018. What the semiconductor industry does show, however, is the states are becoming more aggressive in wielding their power and money to protect their interests and achieve technological self-sufficiency, because this is where it really matters. The EU has gotten involved in this action too, approving its creatively named CHIPS Act, a package of support for protecting its own semiconductor industry. But of course, it's not just the semiconductor industry where the US is playing hardball. The transition from the North American Free Trade Agreement to the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement in 2020 increased US industry requirements, the Buy American Executive Order of 2021 increased domestic goods and services quotas in government contracts, and state powers to block foreign ownership of American companies have also been expanded. This power has been demonstrated just recently when Biden blocked the takeover of US steel by a Japanese company. Of course, the on-again, off-again banning of TikTok, unless its Chinese parent company sells it to an American entity, is another ongoing example of protectionism being exercised in the name of national security. These moves show the Americans are using more direct, aggressive trade policy to protect national interests, a strategy which Trump has promised to accelerate with general tariffs in his second term. And here lies a key point. This is the USA we're talking about. You know, the self-appointed leader of the free world and a symbol of trade liberalisation ever since Ronald Reagan. If they are departing from the notion of free trade by default, then why shouldn't others? The promotion of free trade has been a standard of the global economic order, a principle formally ordained by the World Trade Organization, of which 85% of the world's 193 recognised states are a member of. But the thing about standards is that they're only upheld if the leader also sticks to them. Countries worldwide are not just witnessing the US deviate from these standards, they're also seeing the US undermine the power of the World Trade Organization to actually uphold them. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade is a legal agreement led by the USA in 1947 that still applies to this day via the World Trade Organization. Within the agreement lies Article 21, which allows members to take any action which it considers necessary for the protection of its essential security interests. That seems pretty reasonable. Since 2017, the US has blocked all appointments to the World Trade Organization's appellate body, the institution's highest court, constituting a 7-person judge panel that is responsible for hearing appeals of members and settling disputes. This has meant that the minimum number of judges needed for the body to officially function has not been met since 2019. As a result, there's been no dispute mechanism within the World Trade Organization for 6 years. This has dealt a huge blow to the integrity and power of the WTO, and more specifically, it's meant that member states can implement trade barriers using grounds of national security to invoke Article 21 without resistance. The US has used this to paralyse the World Trade Organization and prevent other members from disputing its trade barriers. In the first 70 years of the General Agreements on Trade and Tariffs and the World Trade Organization, the use of national security exception for trade barriers was extremely rare. But since 2017, the US has announced 30 barriers to trade on the grounds of national security exceptions. As you might expect, this has led to a dramatic knock-on effect. Just look at this graph. The number of barriers to trade based on national security concerns have shot up since 2018, and now they're at their highest levels ever. Lower income countries practically never played this card, but in 2024 they made up 70% of all the national security trade barrier notifications. The COVID-19 pandemic clearly accelerated this trend, but the increase began before this. The precedence is now abundant, and the resistance is now low, paving the way for more and more retaliatory protectionism everywhere you look. India is placing import restrictions on laptops, Indonesia has banned the export of nickel ore, and Brazil has increased tariffs on electric vehicles. Now, let me be clear in saying that globalization is obviously not dead. It's not even in reverse, and protectionist policies have always been around. International trade in goods, services and cash continues to represent a huge portion of economic activity, and big free trade agreements are still being made and negotiated both within regions, like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and between regions, like the EU-Mercosur Agreement, although this agreement hasn't been finalised yet. But even still, these huge agreements are clearly going against the tide. The increase in globalisation is slowing down and has been for a while now. If you follow the trend of the KOF Globalisation Index, you would expect the level of globalisation to peak somewhere this decade. Allied, rival, and positionally ambiguous countries alike are all justifying protectionism as a reactionary measure to the external threats on their national security, however true or false this may be, which is perpetuating further retaliatory policy. This is being deepened by the largest economic and military power in the world withdrawing from global institutions, abandoning multilateral agreements, and incapacitating the global trade regulator. Trust is eroding between countries, and where trust didn't exist in the first place, increasing nationalist sentiment is replacing patience and appeasement with direct aggressive action. In effect, reliance on foreign countries for powerful technologies is no longer comfortable, however tangled up and entrenched these interdependencies have become. You could argue that what's happening is a backlash against over-globalization in the 90s and noughties, where multinational corporations, driven by lowering costs, overextended their supply lines between diametrically opposed political systems and national identities. Remember, this was during a period when the convergence of humanity towards democratic capitalism, facilitated by respected global governance and the collapse of the Soviet Union, looked plausible. It's safe to say that this has not happened, and so the guns-blazing era of globalism has matured towards one with more contextual awareness, where closed-door trade policy, domestic subsidisation of technological industries, and friendshoring is forcing a reshape of the standards. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out our video we made specifically on the China-Taiwan dispute, where we explore how a real invasion of China could play out. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.